into the presentation, but I'll talk a little bit about how this work comes about. But I want to say something about Mount Vernon. So this is the library that I cut school a couple of days in my junior year to come to, because I graduated in '92, and at that time we had the Barron's book in order to choose a college. We couldn't go online. There was no such thing really like that. So I cut school a couple of days. And my mother's from Florida, so in general, I always knew I was going to go to a historically black college. I just knew that. So if I didn't go to FAMU, Florida A&M University, then I had to come up with some second choices, right? That was my first choice. But it is here at this actual library where I get to do some in-depth research about Tuskegee University. And I conclusively changed my mind altogether. There was nowhere I was going to go to Florida A&M University. I was going to Tuskegee because even as a high school student, I loved history. I was a history major in Mount Vernon High School, could have a concentration. And so that was it. I figured I better choose a major that I wouldn't get tired of. So that was it, right? So in a way, when I came through here today, that was sort of like a revisiting the past. It was like, oh wow, I forgot all about, just the specifics of this library. Like, this is the place that I actually sort of seeded this work in an unknowing way, right? And the other thing I want to say about this work is that I didn't do this because I'm a Tuskegee alumni. Like, I could do this whole presentation and never tell you, and I'm an alumni. This comes about as much later, years after I'm out of Tuskegee, as a result of some research that I was doing on another topic, and I come across some information which leads me to this work. And yes, I have some insight on Washington and Africa and archives and all of that kind of stuff related to Tuskegee because I was a history major at Tuskegee. But that's not the impetus. This was too hard for that to be the impetus for this particular work, right? So I just wanted to say those things first. So the book is called Booker T. Washington in Africa, The Making of a Pan-Africanist. And just to just touch on the preface really quickly, the book is about Washington, his role in Africa, not really the traditional American paradigm that many of us know. This is really more or less about his clandestine life and role in African affairs, the stuff that happened behind the scenes, not the mass, not the general narrative that you see in American history about the accommodationists. This is sort of all the things that you would not have known about him while he was living. So one of my first jobs in the City University of New York, where I teach, was as an assistant archivist. And I worked on many collections, like I'll tell you one person, Koch. I was there while his collection was being preserved. It was not open to the public while he was alive, okay? Because people, when your collection is open up, most people don't want to have to answer any questions about it. So it is not public. And so think of Washington in that same way. Most of the things that you will find out in this book, in the archive, his 15 volumes of edited personal papers, none of that was open until 1970s, and he died in 1915, okay? So, many things become obvious and are revealed, but the interpretation of who Washington is all through that time from 1915 on is what the narrative was during his lifetime until the personal papers are open. Then you find out, oh, he was doing this, he was doing that. And so really this is the foundational information for this book, his personal papers. So it's not speculation, it is right there from him, correspondence to and from various people. Okay, so I'm gonna stop with the technical stuff and get into it. So I tell a story essentially about how Washington comes to want to know about Africa, what he shares with Africa, and then 2 policy cases that he's involved in, the African exclusion measure and the Liberian crisis, okay? And both of them have been buried in history until this particular book. Not unknown, but buried, the details buried, right? And so I sort of exhumed the details of both of those cases, okay? So many people think that Booker T. Washington is the founder of Tuskegee University or Tuskegee Institute. That is not true. He is not the founder or the initiator of Tuskegee. This is the initiator of Tuskegee Institute, a man who survived American enslavement. His name was Lewis Adams. He lived in Tuskegee, Alabama, and he was an organizer in the community. Now you have to think about Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. Black people in Tuskegee, Alabama, and in many parts of the South were already very progressive. During Reconstruction, they are voting. They are in political office at the local, state, and federal levels of government. And so Tuskegeans in particular, people who inhabit Tuskegee, are very politically astute. The incumbent senator of Alabama, named Foster, solicited and wanted the black vote in Tuskegee. He goes to Lewis Adams. Lewis Adams is able to deliver the black vote, and therefore Foster is reelected. When Foster is reelected, he comes to Lewis Adams. He comes back and he says, so what do you want, right? What do you want as a result of delivering the vote? And Lewis Adams says something very simple that I think is very telling about who we were at that moment in time, 1881, right out of enslavement, not more than 20 years out of enslavement. Lewis Adams said, a school for my people. Not a team of oxen, not a homestead for me, not some money, not some grease on my palm, a school for my people. It told us about our values, what we valued at that moment. Who's more deprived than someone who survived enslavement? Right? So Lewis Adams is the conceptual founder of Tuskegee Institute. It was actually at that time called the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee. And so Foster goes back to the state of Alabama and he petitions for $2,000 for teachers to fund the Negro Normal School for teachers, which is another, misunderstanding about Tuskegee. That would pay the teachers for the duration of the year. And then that's when Booker T. Washington comes into the story. Those involved in organizing the initial school, Wright Hampton University, and Armstrong sends Booker T. Washington, right? And Booker T. Washington is 26 years old, and he is the person who raises, so I speak of him as the father of Tuskegee, because he was not the conceptual founder. It wasn't his idea initially, but he raises it. He raises the institution from a one-room school in an AME church in Macon, Alabama, and specifically Tuskegee, okay? So he raises it, he cultivates it, he feeds it, and ultimately Booker T. Washington is also the person who, after several years of getting $2,000 from the state of Alabama for teachers only, not for a new structure, not for other materials, not for wood for heat, nothing but $2,000 to pay teachers. Booker T. Washington in 1893 told the state of Alabama to keep their money, okay? He was going to make the institute, he was going to make the school independent. He would go on the road with Ford, and he would raise money for Tuskegee on his own, more money than the state of Alabama was going to give them. And this is why today Tuskegee is one of few institutions, and I believe it's only one of two institutions that have this peculiar classification called quasi-private. State private, but state affiliated when it needs to be. And that's a particular mark of Booker T. Washington, meaning that he was the ultimate politician as far as things like that were concerned, okay? So Tuskegee is made independent of the state of Alabama in 1893 and establishes its new charter as, once again, the Negro Tuskegee Institute, which is what? A school for teachers, not an industrial and vocational school, but an academic school for teachers where they taught the academics and then perfected two trades in order to teach people how to teach those trades, right? So things like pedagogy are part of the curriculum from the beginning, okay? So where did Booker T. Washington get these ideas about Pan-Africanism? I'm actually going to skip this really quickly and go back because this right here, and actually I can't read it, but this right here is something that has to do with Booker T. Washington's intent with regard to Africa and his search for knowledge. In the story of the Negro, even more than my book, Booker T. Washington talks about his views about Africa. He digs into the history of Africa and the history of a people, essentially. And the way that he tells his own story about coming through slavery to freedom, he attempts to tell the story of African people, black people in the United States, as they go from the continent of Africa to the United States and through slavery, okay? And so the story of the Negro is that story, okay? It was criticized at the time, and it was criticized particularly because of the simple fact that the narrative and the conversation and the politics of the time in 1900 was exercising and trying to enforce those Reconstruction Amendments. See, the Civil War had happened. The Reconstruction Amendments were the fruits of that, so to speak, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, 14th Amendment naturalization, equal protection under the law, give you full right to go to school, to travel freely, whatever it is in American society, right? Equal protection under the law and citizenship, right? Along with the right to vote. So 14th Amendment is the right to vote. 14th Amendment is naturalization, equal protection under the law, right? And 15th Amendment is the right to vote. Now, the conversation at the turn of the century is really, the 19th century, is really about invoking and fully enjoying those Reconstruction Amendments. Because what has happened, the Plessy Doctrine has happened, right? And they are going to roll back all the progress made during radical Reconstruction. We've entered a period called the nadir. So it's a very violent time in American history, so on and so forth. And so Washington, while he's aware of that because he's in the thick of it, he is not talking about the politics of the time. He is talking about the Negro at home. And he's not talking about America. He's talking about Africa, okay? And that's what he says, the Negro at home. And yes, he's talking about Africa. And why is he talking about Africa? Because he begins to understand that his interest in Africa is really about his mother. He said, a people who could make a woman such as my mother must have some good in them that geographers had failed to discover. He refused to believe what was written about Africa and African people. And his testimony that it was otherwise was his own mother, right? A people that could produce her must have more to them than what is being said in this context, in the American context. And so he's not buying it. And he goes on his own search and journey to educate himself about Africa and African people, okay? And so this is one of the quotes, and I can't, listen, so I didn't expect to not be able to see this. So one of the things that has to do with pursuing your doctorate is like, I officially can't see so well anymore. You know what I'm talking about, Rob. So I used to be a little arrogant with my eyesight. Now it's like, I'm so humble. I just want to get through the quote. So let's see here. Okay, so I learned, however, that my mother's people had come from across the water, but from a more distant and more mysterious land where people lived a different life from ours, had different customs, and spoke a different language from that I had learned to speak. Of the long and terrible journey by which my ancestors came from their native home in Africa. But not until I was a man did I meet anyone among my people who knew anything definite, either through personal knowledge or through tradition of the country or the people from whom my people sprang. And that comes from the story of the Negro. If you ever are interested in how deep he went in his understanding of Africa, you can read that book. But it was criticized, right? But that gives you some understanding why he's even connecting with Africa. Like, what does he have to do with Africa is what someone might think, right? You're born here in America. What do you know about Africa? You're a slave, right? And clearly he did not feel he was simply someone who survived enslavement. He knew that there was a connection culturally and in values and in history with the African continent. So early Pan-Africanism starts with Henry Sylvester Williams, born in Trinidad, residing in London. He gets the idea, along with the organization he's involved in called the African Association, to initiate a conference called the First Pan-African Conference. Let me go back to him. And the first Pan-African Conference is going to take place in 1900. He contacts many people, but he also contacts Booker T. Washington to ask him to promote the conference. And the reason why I'm stumbling there, because there's the conference and then there's the Congresses, right? Initiated by Du Bois. In 1900, there's the first Pan-African Conference where people from all over the African world would come, meaning from the Caribbean, from Central and South America, from the African continent, and from the United States. Booker T. Washington is involved in planning this conference, although he does not attend. He is the key promoter here. He has significant control of the black press, and so he promotes the conference in the black press. Among the attendees would be William Edward Bookhart Du Bois. And I challenged some things in the context of this book, the traditional notions of Washington and Du Bois, that conflict. I refer to it as sort of a pseudo-conflict, because if you understand what Du Bois writes much later, he later admits that the conflict and the relationship wasn't what it seemed. So in the second chapter of this book on Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanists, I actually addressed the Du Bois-Washington relationship, the 9-year relationship they had before Du Bois publishes Souls of Black Folks, which to the public is their break in relations. But prior to the Souls of Black Folks, there is a 9-year relationship between the two. And so in this book, I actually include the first letter that Du Bois wrote to Booker T. Washington. And I'm going to read it from the book because I can't see that. He says, President Washington, sir, may I ask if you have a vacancy for a teacher in your institution next year? I am a Fisk and Harvard man and have just returned from 2 years abroad as scholar of the John F. Slater Trustees. My specialty is history and social science, but I can teach German, philosophy, natural science, classics. Your wife knows of me, and I refer by permission to President Gilman, Johns Hopkins University. So this was Du Bois' first letter to Booker T. Washington. It was in 1894, July 27th, 1894. And Du Bois is just out of Harvard and coming back from a fellowship abroad in Europe. And he's looking for a job. And Booker T. Washington has an institute. And he hires teachers. Now, certainly Du Bois knew that Tuskegee, there's another letter in here. I put the second letter in here in this book, where you see Du Bois is trying to decide where is he going to go after he leaves this one-year fellowship at Penn, where he ends up doing the famous study on the Philadelphia Negro, the first scientific study of the African population in Philadelphia, right? Breaking down every area of life, right? And studying the population. And his desire is to put the study of the African person in America on a scientific basis, okay? But he does that at Penn. He's treated horribly. PhD and all, he's forced to sleep not sleep, but sit in the hallway. No office for him. The great W.E.B. Du Bois, okay, it didn't matter. And he is planning to, what's his next move going to be? Because University of Pennsylvania didn't offer him anything beyond that fellowship. Okay, let's just understand the whole thing with the black academician too, right? They knew who he was, but that didn't matter. He does the famous study, and he writes Booker T. Washington to say that he would like to come to Tuskegee. Matter of fact, I'll read it really quickly. Just to highlight that Du Bois asked Washington for a job, not once, but twice. Dear Mr. Washington, I feel I should like to work at Tuskegee if I could, be of service to you. My idea has been that there might gradually be developed there a school of Negro history and social investigation, which might serve to help place more and more the Negro problem on a basis of sober fact. I think that in time, various colleges like Harvard, Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and the UPenn would join in supporting such a movement. No, but anyway, what do you think? At the present, I know just how I could be of service. I can teach most primary and secondary branches, preferring, of course, history, economics, social problems. I have had an indication that I may possibly expect an offer from the University of Pennsylvania for a year, after which, if needed, I could come to Tuskegee and perhaps have the active aid of a great college like the UPenn. In any case, I am willing and eager to entertain any proposition for giving my services to your school. Now, of course, he knew that Tuskegee was not a vocational and industrial school, but a school for teachers that taught the academics and then the industries. 44 industries are there. There's no, bones about that. But Tuskegee from 1881 on, and I do break down the curriculum, had pedagogy. Who studies pedagogy? Teachers. Only teachers care about the art of teaching, right? Any of us in here teach, you study pedagogy, okay? History. Du Bois knows that history is being taught at Tuskegee. You'll see some of the slides there. So an industrial and vocational school do not teach the disciplines, those disciplines in particular. Okay, both charters of Tuskegee say that it is a school for teachers. The 1881 charter and the 1893 charter, when the institution is made independent. Du Bois would have known that. And in 1903, I can put him on the campus of Tuskegee the same summer that Souls of Black Folks comes out. And the real conflict between Du Bois and Washington was not around this programmatic difference. I include in the book what Du Bois says, that essentially he puts a few fugitive pieces together from the souls of black folks, essays that he wrote previously for the souls of black folks. And then he writes this chapter on Booker T. Washington, of Mr. Booker T. Washington. But years later, he would write a more honest essay. It's called My Personal Relations with Booker T. Washington. And in it, he admits that his conflict was not a programmatic conflict at all. That was a pseudo-conflict. Why? Because he did not want to discuss his real issue. See, when you have a relationship with somebody, you sort of don't want to air the truth, like the real dirty laundry. And what does he say in My Personal Relations with Booker T. Washington? He says that his real issue was Booker T. Washington's use and even abuse of something called the Tuskegee Machine, which was his secret network that he used to maneuver, politic, but also even to silence in the public realm, which was the black press, the voices of other young black leadership who did not exactly agree with his methods, okay? And so Du Bois it was very much a generational conflict. Du Bois was very angry about that. He was seething over that, okay? And why? Because he knew if Washington wanted to, he could silence any one of Du Bois's peers, and he could silence Du Bois if he had the desire to as well. Okay, Du Bois did not like that at all, and he admits that, right? So this is not even my personal opinion. Du Bois himself tells you what his issue with Washington is in My Personal Relations with Booker T. Washington. The problem with everything I'm telling you is that is one, it's in the personal papers. Two, there is somebody who gave a interpretation of Washington had a monopoly on all of this information for many, many years, and that is a man named Lewis Harlan, okay? A white American scholar who wrote 2 volumes of a biography on Booker T. Washington. He edited Booker T. Washington's personal papers, transcribing and then putting his little editorial notes. He got a major grant from the Library of Congress. He wrote numerous articles on Booker T. Washington, yet he said he hated him. But he built his whole career on him. So this is why everything I'm telling you is not a matter of public discourse or historical discourse in the public realm. Why? Because Harlan had a monopoly on the interpretation of Booker T. Washington, unequivocally. It's without dispute. But he also had a personal opinion of Booker T. Washington, right? And I covered that in the preface, and I'm doing things a little bit out of order, so just bear with me. So let me just read this really quickly. There's a piece in here where another scholar writes about Lewis Harlan's interpretation of Washington and the work he did on Washington and how he built his career on Booker T. Washington, okay? However, he had a personal disdain for this historical figure who was not even alive at the time. Now, I was a student at Tuskegee, and I knew the head archivist who had been there, I don't know, many moons before I got there, a man named Dr. Danny Hill Williams. And he was at Tuskegee when Lewis Harlan came to preserve Washington's personal papers. And anybody who knows about that, you get to transcribe them. You can't change anything, but you can put your little editorial notes at the bottom, right? So the point is that Harlan was not committed to that endeavor. I found errors, it was faulty, but he was tapped to do this work, and he became, how would you say, as wealthy as a scholar or academician can become in doing this, okay? So Harlan was a very talented historian and a fine writer who has an amazing hostility to Booker T. Washington. One wonders why a person who is so negative and so hostile towards a historical figure would choose to write a biography about him. Lewis Harlan will tell you that he began a study in the 1960s with the assumption that Washington was an Uncle Tom, that he was a sellout, and then he worked on research and writing about Washington for the next 25 years. He has said that along the way he became more respectful of Washington because he wasn't purely a sellout, just a sneaky, underhanded man. And so this is who has dominated the public discourse. Even the terms of calling Washington a Tom, a sellout, comes from a white American historian who may have had some experience in World War II, but in his own biography talked about having racist predilections. Okay? But so, so this is why we don't know the truth interpretation of Du Bois and Washington's relationship, on and on and on and on and on, right? I'm gonna move forward because I'll stay here. So Washington was involved in Pan-Africanist activity. In 1912 at Tuskegee, there was a conference on the Negro, the International Conference on the Negro at 1912 that was held at Tuskegee. Basically what happened at Tuskegee was, yes, it was an academic school for teachers that taught you to perfect two industries so that you could go on to teach other people. But at Tuskegee, there was 44 industries. And at the International Conference on the Negro, all 44 of these industries were opened up for examination by people throughout the African world, meaning the continent of Africa, the Caribbean, the Central and South America, and the United States. And the idea was not to assert Tuskegee as some exceptional and extraordinary place, but to take the best practices that you saw there to your own locale. Okay? In other words, take Tuskegee methods back to your own locale and use them to benefit the people as much as possible. So I'm just giving you details about that in there. At this particular conference, the International Conference on the Negro, there are 8 educators who come from the island of Jamaica, and they see the 44 industries opened up, okay? They take the word of this institution and the 44 industries and the fact that in the conference resolutions that the conference resolutions included the desire to erect a Tuskegee-like institute in Jamaica. And they take this information back to Jamaica, share it with none other than Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey initiates his own relationship with Booker T. Washington in 1912 and begins to write him. One of the things he writes him is that, one, Washington is the person who inspired him after reading Up From Slavery. He says, and this is his words, I quote, he informed me of my doom to be a race leader. After the International Conference on the Negro, and he has some understanding of what's happening at Tuskegee, he models the Universal Negro Improvement Association that he establishes after the Tuskegee model. This is why the UNIA is about industries, businesses in various industries. Not only that, Garvey would have a relationship with Washington via correspondence, and the invitation to come to the United States was extended by Booker T. Washington himself. Garvey intends, through correspondence, to come and visit Tuskegee to see these 44 industries in this institution that is self-sustaining. Okay? And he does so. He does come, but not before Booker T. Washington defeats an exclusionary measure that would have locked him out. Okay? Him and any African person like him. So we went to that. So First Pan-African Conference, this is what Booker T. Washington promoted in the context of the Pan-African Conference in connection with the assembling of so many Negroes in London from different parts of the world. A very important movement has just been put upon foot. It is known as the Pan-African Conference. And notice he says it's a movement, right? Not just simply a conference. Representatives from Africa, the West Indian Islands, and other parts of the world asked me to meet them a few days ago with a view to making a preliminary program for this conference. And we had a most interesting meeting. It is surprising to see the strong intellectual mode which many of these Africans and West Indians possess. And so he writes this to the editor of the Indianapolis Freeman here in the United States in promotion of the first Pan-African Conference. So I'm going to jump to one thing. So what was Tuskegee trying to do in terms of connecting itself with Africa? Once the Tuskegee model is perfected, Washington seeks to take his best thing, which is the model, and share it with the African world. And so at Tuskegee, you had various industries. You see, they had tailoring shop. This is Alabama Hall, one of the first buildings erected by Tuskegee students. This is a vocational dairy class at Tuskegee. And we had a joke at Tuskegee that the milk in the milk bank actually came, the milk in the cafeteria actually came from the milk bank, one of the two farms on the campus. It wasn't true, but people used to say that. A course in mental philosophy. I don't even know what that is, but they had it. I mean, it's just really, like, what is mental philosophy? Do you know, Rob?
No.
Yeah, see, right. I mean, I know what philosophy is. I'm teaching an African philosophy course in the fall, but like mental philosophy, that would be interesting to know. But Tuskegee had a course in mental philosophy. All these images are from, they're in the public domain, but they're from Tuskegee, originated in Tuskegee archives, right? And they go to public domain. Agricultural students. So this was the School of Agriculture somewhere around the turn of the century, 1895. To 1915. And so they have a school of agriculture. In 1895 in particular, George Washington Carver would come to Tuskegee and he would lead the School of Agriculture, right? He would produce many things. He would have many experiments. He would have many inventions, and most of them were stolen by the U.S. government, and they patented them. And he made no money off of them. Okay, so today you can go to the Carver Museum and see most of his inventions. Course in history. Now, of course, unfortunately, they had a course in history. Anybody who's paying attention, and you see the dead old white guys on the wall. But I hope they learned, because Washington did know something about African history. I hope they learned some African history too, right? Or some African history in America. In particular, right? How we survived and defeated the institution of slavery. That being said, the point is that no person who is simply involved in the vocation cares anything about history. Okay, not really. And so this is actually another image. It's in the book that's from the archives. This is an academic course in brick masonry. And what it says, I'm going to try to read it because I definitely can't read it there. It says, an academic class, a problem in brick masonry. Mr. Washington always insisted upon correlation, that is drawing the problem from the various shops and laboratories. In other words, so they had to engage in the theory of brick making. And who engages in theory? Once again, teachers, right? Teachers need to know the theory so that they can continue to teach it, the practitioners, right? So not merely just generally the practice, but the theory behind it. So they had to understand the theoretical side of brick masonry, okay? Not just simply how to make some bricks. And I just included this picture because they just look good. In front and center is George Washington Carver, right? And the gentlemen around him are some of the Tuskegee staff and faculty. But this gives you a good idea of what the people who survived enslavement looked like at the turn of the century. Not broken, you know. And then once again, of course, George Washington Carver, front and center there. And this is just an image of the Booker T. Washington. He's right there in the front, and some of the Tuskegee staff and faculty. This is the International Students Club, because Tuskegee will become a hub for students from the Caribbean, Central and South America, and Africa. As early as 1893, you have students, a steady flow of students coming from Africa to Tuskegee. And Washington was very interested in maintaining that and protecting that. And that really connects to the last case in this book. This is the chapel at Tuskegee, and very interesting. Some people, by the way, this book came out like 7 years ago. So one of the things that someone took me to task on, they said, well, why did you say that Washington may not have been particularly religious? I said that in a lecture one time. And the reason why I said that is because there was a chapel on the campus. But if you want to know what he talked about in his chapel, it is in a book. The book is called Character Building. Character building, which is a distinctively African value, to build one's character. Okay? We can find that all over African cosmology, building one's character. Okay? Like, you know, the saying that's in our culture in particular, beauty is as beauty does. Well, that's about character. That's not hocus pocus. That's about character. So in the Institute's chapel, every Sunday he gave a lecture on character building, and then he compiled it in a book. Okay? One of the Tuskegee missions was for people to go back to their own communities and make a contribution. Head, heart, and hand. Okay? And Washington and others there saw it as a sacred mission, that you were indebted to be in service to the people who were responsible for your advancement. Okay? And so most of the students who would have come to the Institute at this time did not pay tuition. They would work full-time the first year and go to school part-time, and work part-time the remaining 4 years and go to school full-time. The students were all on a work program up until the 60s, maybe even into the 1970s. This meant Tuskegee had a sustainable labor force that could weather economic fluctuations in the country, because their students were their laborers, their students were their staff, and it also ensured their education at the same time. Okay? Now, good, I'm finally moving along because I felt like I'm moving so slow. Booker T. Washington and the Congo Free State. Booker T. Washington begins to engage in some of the politics in the world, and he finds out as a result of working with a sociologist from the University of Chicago that he hires, is an employee of his, and he finds out about the Congo Free State and the atrocities being committed in the Congo by King Leopold. King Leopold is a Belgian king who had the nerve to declare that he was the sole owner of a territory in Africa. Not just any territory in Africa, but the most wealthy territory in Africa then, now, and maybe forever. Whoever controls the Congo and the 9 surrounding countries controls the bulk of the world's resources. King Leopold would have the nerve to declare himself the sole owner of the Congo, and the United States was the first Western nation to affirm that and say, yes, you are the sole owner. Can you imagine one little man who never stepped his foot in the Congo dare to say that he owned it and the millions of African people who are there? And that's what Leopold did. Amongst other things, he would commit numerous atrocities in the region, comparable to that of enslavement. He essentially killed about 10 million African people in the Congo, mining rubber, amongst other things, okay? And so Washington knew about this. He had a researcher. Let us be clear, Robert Parks was not an advisor to Booker T. Washington. Robert Parks was a researcher that Booker T. Washington hired, okay? And when he would research certain issues, Washington would decide whether or not he was going to write about it in the public realm, because he had significant control of the black press and he had significant international influence as a result of his book, Up From Slavery. Washington begins to propagandize against King Leopold in the press. He fires off a series of articles propagandizing against the atrocities in the Congo. And he gets the attention of King Leopold through one of his aides. And then the aide invites him to the Congo, to Belgium, and say, no, that's not what we're doing. We're not hurting African people here. But of course, Washington doesn't believe him because there's enough, information by this time to document that. He says, and I open up actually chapter 4, which is all about Booker T. Washington's relationship with the international world, African world, including this scenario, which is a transformative period in his life. He's learning about the Congo. He will have relationships with various African nationalists who are experiencing what colonialism is like. And he realizes it's very similar to American enslavement, okay? But the Congo is what he goes to the press about. And one of the letters he writes, articles he writes, my interest in the race to which I belong and in the advancement of the cause of humanity, regardless of race, is my excuse for discussing a subject which I have not hitherto called attention to in public print. The oppression of the colored race in any part of the world means sooner or later the oppression of the same race elsewhere. No one had sounded a lot like Martin Luther King, but listen, it's like who said it first, right? This is many moons before Martin Luther King's not even alive when this is written, right? So he goes on to say, no one who has followed conditions as they have been developing in what is called the Congo Free State in Africa can fail to reach the conclusion that there is something wrong, a wrong so widespread that civilized nations cannot escape their duty nor evade their responsibility. And so he is talking about the Congo Free State, and he attempts to propagandize against those atrocities. He joins the organization that still exists today called Friends of the Congo, and he assumes the position of vice president. He lobbies the then White House under Theodore Roosevelt, who he is an advisor to, but he lobbies even Theodore Roosevelt on behalf of the Congo, that the United States needs to do something in terms of diplomacy regarding the atrocities in Congo, okay? One of the many African nationalists that Washington would be in touch with during this transformative period is Dusé Muhammad Ali, an Egyptian-born, which was a newspaper, from Egypt to Nigeria, is the distributor of the Negro World by Marcus Garvey's paper, but in Nigeria. There was a dialectical relationship going on amongst black people, African people in the world at that time. So Dusé Muhammad Ali is communicating with both Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey at the time. And they're sharing information about the condition of black people and of African people throughout the world, a common experience in terms of oppression. South Africa. He's a founding member of the African National Congress, a Columbia University graduate and Oxford Law student. He is in communication with Booker T. Washington, and he shares many things about the condition of African people under South African apartheid. Okay? Washington would not have had any other way to know about what was happening in South Africa except for through his direct correspondence with these individuals featured here. Casely Hayward of Ghana, he's formerly the Gold Coast. He was a delegate to Congress in 1912. He would contribute to the conference. Then there's John Dube of South Africa. He was the founder of the Christian Industrial School in Olange, the first school founded by an African for African people in South Africa. And then he also was the first educator to reproduce the Tuskegee model and its methods in Africa. And there would be a number of institutions that will reproduce the Tuskegee model all over the African continent. Washington had a particular way of exporting the Tuskegee model once perfected. He would export it through his students, his graduates, right? Former students, graduates. He would export it through his African nationalist contacts, such as Dube and others. And he would share the methods at events like the International Conference on the Negro, where he would share the program and the model and methods utilized at Tuskegee with the African world. This is the Liberian Commission. So in 1907, 1908, Booker T. Washington would be contacted by the General Consul of Liberia, who knew that the French, British, and the Germans were attempting to annex major portions of Liberia. At this time, Liberia is one of only 2 African nations that has not been colonized. Okay? Everywhere else in Africa is colonized by European and imperialist forces, except for Liberia, and the other is what? Ethiopia. Americo-Liberians, people who had survived the institution of slavery in America, are expatriated back to Liberia as early as 1847, as at the behest, really, to be quite frank, of a very racist organization called the American Colonization Society. Now, there's great irony in that because many Back to Africa movements will be criticized. Garvey, Blyden, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, and others will be criticized for wanting to go back to Africa. But the most successful Back to Africa movement was created by a racist organization called the American Colonization Society, which was involved in the establishment of Liberia in 1847. Nobody criticizes that. So if black people who survived slavery said we want to go back to Africa, it's like, you can't do that. But if white Americans who don't want to put up with free African and black people in the United States say, go back to Africa, it's okay. So Liberia itself becomes a nation at the behest of the American Colonization Society. Today, the Library of Congress has a whole collection of all the black people, all the African people who survived the institution of slavery and wrote letters to this racist organization because they were the only ones financing a return to Africa. And many of them wrote that they would give up whatever they had to leave the United States, living under the terror and the violence that happened at that period in American history. And particularly during Washington's time, 1895 to 1915, known as the Nadir. Reconstruction was reversed with serious waves of violence, not in any sophisticated way. We don't want to compete with you economically. You are the skilled persons in this country, in every industry, coming out of enslavement, right? This is why. Most people know now about Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, But there were many industrial, sustainable black communities prior to the turn of the century coming out as a result of radical Reconstruction. Most of them were destroyed violently, okay? Because there was not going to be any competition, right? You could still just simply murder them, and that is what generally happened. So back to Liberia. Liberia is, in Washington's mind, an example of an independent African nation that is uncolonized by and inhabited by the people who survived enslavement here. Now, there's problems there, right? And I won't go deep into it. You have to read the book. This is the part you have to read the book for. But this, just to give you an understanding of Booker T. Washington's attitude towards Liberia, because he identified with Liberia and Liberians, both the indigenous Liberian person and the Americo-Liberian population. So you have to read the case, and you'll see his criticism he gives of the Americo-Liberian population that goes back to Africa and then marginalizes the indigenous African person, which is a problem, right? Institutionalizes systems of discrimination against the indigenous African person, which is why you have for many moons, the political power only in one group in Liberia, which are Americo-Liberians. They are actually many of us, right? So if you were returned there, that is the Americo-Liberian population. But Washington, I opened chapter 5 up in terms of the Liberian crisis with a quote from Washington. He says, "No one, not even the citizens of Liberia, is more interested in the progress and success of the republic than I am." And why is he saying that? Because he wants to see the chance of survival for us on the continent of Africa. He knows that Western nations have gobbled up all the territories on the African continent. And here is one of two of the only independent African nations on the continent. And he would like to see the chances of survival. Washington would be the key negotiator in saving Liberia from annexation, seizing of territories by the French and British and German colonial forces on the ground. The stance of the British and the French and German on the ground is that if the United States does not want Liberia, we will take it. The indigenous population will not be able to hold us back. We will take it. So in other words, the United States could use force, but the United States did not want Liberia because it had not figured out how it could exploit Liberia. Liberia has rubber. And by the end of this case, you will see how that plays a role in that. However, Washington is the person, in this case, is a perfect example of how he was a long-term, durable negotiator on behalf of African people and African interests, because he manages to get a deal that would preserve the future of Liberia, okay? So Liberia exists today. In light of this case, Liberia could have not existed by the end in 1912, okay? So I won't go all into the details. And then there's one more case in the book. It's called the African Exclusion Measure. I know that's such a terrible picture, but that's the Panama Canal. And why do I show you Panama Canal? Because in 1894, in 1914, there is a completion of this very canal. For those of you who know or don't know what the Panama Canal is, it's really just a series of locks, right? So they're drilling through the land, and there's a series of locks that close and allow water to come up and raise the ships over the land. This way one can go from the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf through the landmass and into the Pacific Ocean and to Asia and that part of the world without having to go all the way around South or North America, that landmass. So whoever did this would would become a superpower in that time as a nation. And so Theodore Roosevelt was very interested in making America a superpower and being able to open up the waterways for trade and industry, right, in the world. They can trade now from east to west without having to go through that area. I'm going to skip a lot of things, but basically the laborers on the Panama Canal were the African and black population who had been enslaved and survived it there. And they would be the laborers on the Panama Canal. Although an American endeavor, most of the laborers were people from various Caribbean islands, Central South America, primarily. And of course, black people from Central and South America and the Caribbean. They would become very used to American wages. The United States was aware of that. So in November 1894, this canal was completed. November 1894, I'm sorry, why do I keep saying that? In November of 1914, this canal was completed. In December, the last day of the year, December 31st, 1914, you had a senator from Missouri who understood the canal had been completed. And he wanted to make it clear to the Caribbean population who was black and who had labored on the Panama Canal, thank you for your labor. No on the question of immigration. And so he initiated an amendment to the larger immigration bill of 1914 that came out of the Senate that said to exclude anyone of the black or African race from the United States forever. This is, if you look black or if you were African, you could not immigrate to the United States. And not only would it exclude you, it would put you in the same category as undesirables and criminals attempting to enter the United States. This is one of the early on-record legislative attempts to criminalize blackness. And it passed in the Senate. Okay? James Reed was his name. It passed in the Senate with no debate. So if anybody who does research like this, you know you can go straight to the congressional record and you can see the measure, you can see the debate, you can see the objection. He proposed several things that did not pass, to lock this group, to lock that group out from the United States. But when he said, quote, to exclude African race from the United States, it passed with flying colors. This amendment to the larger immigration bill was due to go to the House of Representatives the very next week. So this measure or this amendment passed on December 31st, 1914. The first week of the year, January 1st through 7th. Okay, this measure was due to go to the Congress in January of 1915. And Washington knew this. He read the congressional record. He had known about the passing of this measure in the Senate. In spite of what people might have thought about him, he paid attention to American politicians. My own opinion is that he did not trust them. And so you only keep your finger on people you don't trust. That being said, he knew it was coming up before the Congress, and he was determined to defeat this measure in the Congress. He does a three-pronged attack on this. He exposes this legislation, this piece of legislation that is about to come before the House, to the press. He still has significant control of the black press, and he outs them. Okay, he talks about this particular measure. He also puts into action his Tuskegee machine, which is a secret network of power brokers, who he sends to Washington, D.C. And he tells them, pull every string possible to defeat this unfair and racist measure. Okay? And so he also has his secret network that goes to D.C. to poll and hold up the Congress. He also tells them that he wants them to poll them so that they can effectively identify the congressmen that are in favor of this legislation and directly challenge them. He also, so he writes to the black press, he exposes that. He also sends the Tuskegee machine. And many of the people who are involved in the Tuskegee machine are people who many thought were Washington's critics. For example, Francis Grimke. Grimke notably criticized Booker T. Washington in the public realm. But when you go into his personal papers, you see that him and Grimke were aligned. Grimke is in fact a part of his Tuskegee machine. Grimke is a key negotiator and figure in this particular case. And Washington thanks him for his direct challenge to U.S. politicians in this racist piece of legislation. Washington's words also make it on the floor of the House as they have a ferocious debate around African and black immigration to the United States. So the words that Washington writes in the public press end up on the floor of the House through a representative from New York. Okay, and some of what he says is that, I'll give you just one of the articles that he wrote. He says, through your newspaper, I desire to appeal to the American Congress and to the people of the United States in favor of fair play and justice in connection with the immigration bill now pending before the United States Senate, which by amendment excludes from coming into this country any person of African descent. That is in his personal. So when he writes this, it has already passed in the Senate, and he knows it's going to go to the House of Representatives. He also is the person who effectively identifies all the Caribbean and Central and South American nations that this would impact. Okay, and today we know within the black community there is a lot of national identity, right? That is really sometimes people's primary identity, meaning Jamaican, Haitian, all of that. So there are nations and people that are called by name here by U.S. congressmen to say effectively, no, we want to lock these specific people out. For example, before the voting, a relatively short discussion began on the floor. Senator Williams of Mississippi was the first to argue in favor of the amendment to lock out. He stated, "We are beginning to receive now some undesirable immigration of the African race." So he doesn't care that you say you're from Jamaica. African race from the West Indies. A great many Jamaican Negroes have been employed upon the Panama Canal, and after the termination of that work, having become accustomed to American wages, which they received down in Panama, a great many more of them begin to come to the Gulf ports. Florida and Louisiana have already received a considerable proportion of African immigration from the French and English West Indies. That is to say, immigration of West Indians who are wholly or partly African in race. So the U.S. government is not really, they don't care how one identifies. However, Washington is very clear that the U.S. government is talking about black people in the Caribbean, Central, South America, and from the African continent. Okay? And he moves accordingly. Of course, I'm not going to tell you the end of the case. You have to read the book. But we know that he is successful because a year later, Marcus Garvey is able to come into the United States. Were it not for Washington's efforts, so you have to read how he effectively finishes this case off, but it is defeated in the Congress as per Washington's organizing power, some would say soft power, in an effort to challenge this racist piece of legislation, which would have changed the demographic of Black people in the United States. So Marcus Garvey would come 1 year and 2 months after the defeat of this measure. That would not have been possible. There would be many others. For those of you who like Barack Obama, know Barack Obama. His father would 1915 on, right? 1915 on, no African or Black immigration. So here is this person who many have thought was a very American figure, who overwhelmingly identified with the Black and African world, international world, that he would challenge U.S. politicians in their attempt to, in effect, pass this racist policy. Now that is what, these two cases are what is the basis for saying Washington is a Pan-Africanist. Not in sheer rhetoric, but in measurable ways. Today, this case still impacts African and Black immigration, okay? It would be defeated this time and never again tried in the same way, okay? So one of his motivations is that since 1893, he had a steady flow of students from the African continent. And yes, he had an affinity for Africa. You can read all about it in the story of the Negro. That because he at one time thought he could be a missionary. Not because he was religious, but because he wanted to be involved, in his words, in Africa in some significant way. And so, and he only knew people going to Africa as missionaries, so that was that part, right? But his goal, he realizes that this is not going to happen, and that's part of him sending his students to, his graduates to Africa as well. So Washington, injects himself in many instances in these situations, but with the African exclusion measure, 1893, steady flow of students from the African continent, who he understands will come and learn at Tuskegee and return to the African continent and implement Tuskegee methods, okay, and practices. That being said, he is seeking to protect that. This measure would have ended that. And of all the groups of people that would benefit from the defeat of this measure, it is only his students from Africa who, in writing, thank him for the defeat of this measure. So, yeah, okay, I think that's it. Okay. Okay, Rob. So we're going to do a little Q&A for folks who have some questions. Oh, let me say this one thing. So Washington, it was one of the biggest things he does because he defeats this measure in January 1915, and he dies in November of 1915. He would never declare and openly talk about this measure. He didn't care to, and that's the difference. But he would, it would be one of the biggest things he does before he dies, right? And so he dies in November of that same year. And that's the procession. For those of you who don't know, Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver are both buried on the campus of Tuskegee, right? On the highest point.
Since I just came on stage, first let me just welcome all of you on behalf of the Mount Vernon Library to today's Decipher monthly presentation. It's an immense pleasure to have Dr. Tyrene Wright here to discuss with us her pioneering account of the life of
Thank
Booker
you.
T. Washington. I do want to make clear that as a serious student, fellow student of the Black freedom struggle, both nationally and internationally, one of the things that really stands out about Dr. Wright's work is it does represent a genuine break in the conventional interpretations of the life of Booker T. Washington. One of the highest honors I think that you can ever pay a fellow academic is having learned something genuinely new. And I have to say that the book was chock full of all kinds of new revelations about Washington. I am one of many academics who have been heavily influenced both by the life of W.E.B. Du Bois and also the interpretation of Washington's life as transmitted to the academic community through Harlan's work above all. And I have to say that I labored under many of the misperceptions about Washington's significance in the Black freedom struggle, and really caused me to rethink, you know, the image that many of us have inherited of Washington as an accommodationist, or, to use the colloquial phrase, an Uncle Tom, who was willing to do anything at all in order to, you know, advance his own personal interests at the cost of those of Black people. And I think clearly Dr. Wright's work forces us to think carefully about that. I'm only going to come up for a few key questions.
Okay.
And then we're going to expand the discussion to the rest of the audience. I know some of you did have questions, so I'm not going to take too much time. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity to join Dr. Wright on stage.
Okay.
I think that the critical question, or the basic starting questions for the audience that may not necessarily be as tutored in African American history and political philosophy is just exactly what does one mean by Pan-Africanism.
Okay.
Although I think it's implicit, certainly throughout the book and in your comments, I think it's important for us to state explicitly what we mean by Pan-Africanism so that we can more effectively gauge its place in our own political strategies that we must be mindful about developing. And so I'll start with that.
Okay, so in chapter 2, I name a whole chapter after. So as a researcher, you always write a theoretical chapter, right? And so the theoretical chapter is a chapter called Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist. And I come out of a political organization that was Pan-Africanist in nature. That being said, I invoke the historical definition of Pan-Africanism from the first Pan-African Conference, which in a very bare bones way was simply the unification of African people for the purpose of eradicating oppression and exploitation. That's a bare bones. Now, there will become layers that are added on by different proponents of Pan-Africanism over time, right? And I talk about that. I address that in the book, that later on, later on there will be other Pan-Africanists who express it a different way, but with the same core value, that eradicating oppression or exploitation, meaning addressing the condition of African people, of Black people, everywhere we are. And then all of them have their own unique edge. So when I use the term Pan-Africanism in here, I'm talking about that bare bone definition, working definition of Pan-Africanism, and then so Du Bois, a organizational line and method and approach to Pan-Africanism, okay? With Washington, he has a particular line and approach to Pan-Africanism, which is independence through industry, okay? He believes by owning and operating industry. I skipped a lot in this presentation just so that we could do this, because I could go very deep on every chapter there. However, one of the things that you would get from this book is what is Washington's method. And so along with understanding he is going to oppose oppression and exploitation, the liberatory method is to be owners and operators and masters of men, essentially. And yeah, I'm being funny by quoting that because you know that that's actually Thomas Dixon and not Washington. Yes, so that's what I mean by Pan-Africanism. If you want to know if something is Pan-Africanist, it is not, there needs to be some gains, some tangibles for the population, okay? So I teach an international course on Pan-African history and Pan-African history and organizing, which is an ideological training course. And this is internationally. Most of the people that I'm teaching are on the African continent and abroad. I always give the example that if we all come together at my house, for instance, and I cook a dinner, is it Pan-Africanist because some are from the continent of Africa, some are from the Caribbean, some from the United States? No. It's not Pan-Africanist. You know why? Because we did not come together to strategize around our common condition, which is exploitation and oppression. And if it does not produce anything for African people, for Black people, then it is not Pan-Africanist.
Right.
No. Pan-Africanism is a verb. Pan-Africanist is a noun. It is a practice that should produce something for us. So you cannot engage in something that is adverse to African people and say just because we represent every corner of the earth that it is good for African people. How often do we get together and it produces nothing for us? That's not Pan-Africanist. So I know there's a contemporary conversation going on in social media about ADOS and Pan-Africanism not doing anything for anybody. Well, the things that you're talking about that don't produce anything for African people and Black people, they're not Pan-Africanist. Because of that very point, because they produce nothing for us. And Pan-Africanism addresses our condition as exploited people and oppressed people under white supremacy and culture.
So does that mean that Dr. King, Malcolm X, and clearly Marcus Garvey were all Pan-Africanists?
I wouldn't say all of those individuals were Pan-Africanists.
You said it's in the benefit of
race. Right.
So-
And so what you'll see in this book is that at the end of each case, I qualify, right? So it's not, let me give you a perfect example. I was involved in an activist organization here in New York. I won't call their name because I just won't. It wasn't a negative thing. However, we were challenging the Department of Education to incorporate Black and African history into the curriculum. In some small way, they acted like they were going to do it, and they said, we're going to put the Underground Railroad in part of the New York State curriculum. And we all go, yay! Because we think it's just that. But then you qualify it. Who are they going to talk about as the agents and actors on the Underground Railroad? Not the African people who were brave enough to risk their lives and everyone they were connected to's lives to escape, but the gracious white people that were working in the Underground Railroad. Really? I mean, fine, but that's not African history. That's not Black history. So we've got to, like John Henrik Clarke talks about, we've got to qualify the victory before we celebrate the victory. We're always ready to celebrate first, but the reality is we need to qualify things, right? Weigh and measure it. Is it good for us, ultimately?
So, Dr. Wright,
Yes.
I would like to congratulate you on your book.
Thank you.
So you illustrated,
Thank you.
right? So you illustrated when you speak of Pan-Africanism. Okay, down through the years, when out of all the other books that has been taught in school or down in history on Booker T. Washington. So you think that one or any, the kids nowadays has learned or can gain anything from the other books that has been taught among Booker T. Washington? When you explain Pan-Africanism, is that for the kids nowadays, or would you consider that kids, like let's say like 10 years ago, or when during my time coming in school, I was taught, I don't know if I'm getting the same understanding from what Booker T. Washington was being, what we was being read about him, and just so you're actually, turning, well, it's a whole new thing for me, and I think it's the way that you explained it. I haven't read your book, but I'm sure that I will be reading and getting your book. Mm-hmm. So I just want to clarify that you're saying that in Pan-Africanism, that according to your book is illustrated, that we can gain other conception of Booker T. Washington?
Yes. So let me start with your first question, first part. Okay, it just escaped my mind. The first part of his question, do you remember what this was?
About previous interpretations. Of
Okay,
that.
so, all right, so other
Their
books, right, that you can read on Booker T. Washington. One, The Story of the Negro, which is called, the full title is The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery. And surprisingly enough, the book is, I would say, 80% about Africa. And he says, he identifies, so you don't have to question how he identifies. He makes it clear how he identifies in there. He identifies with African people. He identifies with the African continent. This is why he even says, he uses the term Negro, but he says what? The Negro at home. Where's home? Not America, Africa. When you read the chapter, you know he's not talking about America. He's certainly talking about Africa. So where did he get that from? A person who lived through enslavement. He's around 9, because the mark of enslavement is that you really don't know when you are born. So somewhere around when he should have been about 9 or so, he remembers being emancipated. What does he think about Africa? How does he know about Africa? Right? And for him, his mother is that symbol of African people, right? And he said, people that could produce my mother must have some good in them that geographers have failed to discover. And so that is his inspiration, because he's talking about values and principles and the caliber of person. And if anybody knows anything about African cosmology, it's more based on that than some external savior and practice, right? Many African cultures are based on building one's character, building one's power, okay? And that goes way, way, way back into the antiquity of Africa, right? So Kemet and so on. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Wright, just one more question. If you have a question, please just mic for recording.
The other part, okay. Can I continue?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So the other part of what I was going to say to you is that my interpretation of Booker T. Washington is, I think, so let me say this. So most of the time when I do this work, I don't really ever talk much about being a Tuskegee alumni because, like I said, it actually is not the impetus for me doing this work. You'll learn in the preface how I get to this and why I do it. Washington, even at Tuskegee, by students who come across the country to go to Tuskegee, will still say in freshman orientation, where we are forced to read Up From Slavery, that Booker T. Washington was blank, 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 dot, 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 all the negative stuff. On the campus, we're right there, but we're ill-informed. And now what I'm doing as a scholar, as an intellectual, is challenging a dominant notion of Washington, because what we have to understand is that there is a 100-year history propelled by Lewis Harlan and others, primarily white scholars, who had a monopoly on the interpretation of Booker T. Washington, to the point where most black scholars were almost told not to touch Washington. Okay? Read the preface, thoroughly, because I talk about this whole thing that takes place primarily in the American Academy. Okay? And what I'm arguing is that whatever Booker T. Washington was or wasn't, he belonged to us. He was produced by us. We will weigh and measure him. Okay? We will praise or condemn him. We will not allow any other group of people. So this is where, agency comes in at, right? Agents and actors, having agency, a voice. When do another group of people get to condemn your leadership when your leadership wasn't in service to them? They were in service to you. And what do you think about him? And it's unacceptable for your opinion of that person who gave their life in service to you, right? For your opinion to be based on a group that is essentially the antithesis to your life, your well-being, and your freedom. That's problematic. So, I'm critical. You can see in the preface of the book where I'm clearly saying that this is the work that African and black scholars must have the courage to do. If I found that Washington was worthy of condemnation, I would condemn him. And if I found that he was worthy because you're only worthy in terms of how you serve us. That is the way, and that is how I'm weighing and measuring him and all other leadership during his time and after. Not, it's not about icon worship or, personality cults and stuff like that. This is about who adequately served African and black people, people who had survived enslavement and needed so much. Right? Right. Yes?
So,
okay.
So this Lewis Harlan biography.
Yes. Yes.
So he spent his whole life writing about him.
Yes, he did.
Why? Like, if he was so disdainful, I can't understand his motivation. Like, okay, so he made a lot of money, but he could have written about somebody that he admired. Do you think it was like a setup, or like they were trying to tarnish his reputation?
Well, there is
white academics.
So it's twofold. He made a lot of money.
Right. Yeah, but he could have written about somebody else.
He made a lot of money, one, right?
Yeah, right.
That's enough for some people just to make a lot of money, right? Two,
Okay.
he comes from a line of scholars, and I trace it for you, and it's not so, how this works in scholarship. You've got to call the names of those who did the work before you.
Right.
And there is a man named Robert Norrell who was on the case with this, right? So this part of it is not original to me. I deepen this understanding around
And then we
this.
can't really know why.
Right, so Norrell adequately addresses the fact that there's Du Bois. Well, you have to understand that Du Bois is a complex figure, just as complex as Booker T. Washington, right? Just for him to admit himself, like, you realize that in my work, I put together the pieces of Du Bois admitting that he lied about a programmatic difference, right? The vocational education and the intellectual talent intent, right?
Right.
So the essay is called "My Personal Relations with Booker T. Washington." Nobody puts a gun to his head and said, "Admit that you lied about that." No, he admits it on his own, and years after Washington is dead, said, "Hey, the truth is I didn't want to discuss my generational issue with the public about Washington. So I put it on, like I'm not really into the vocational industrial thing." But anybody who cared to look would know Tuskegee wasn't simply a industrial vocational school. It wasn't that at all. It was a school of teachers. It's producing more college-educated blacks than anything else. So the point of saying this is that Du Bois, even after Washington dies, he is seething, he's disgruntled, not so much for Washington. If you look in Washington's personal papers, what he's saying about Du Bois, it's not the same energy, it's not the same preoccupation, right? Du Bois is, the power difference and the age difference and all of that is an issue for Du Bois, right? And Washington let me go back. Washington does become disenchanted with Du Bois about something specific. I talk about it. Du Bois spends the summer of 1903 in Tuskegee, and you can put him on the campus of Tuskegee. He was friends with Margaret Murray Washington, who went to Fisk and was Washington's third and last wife. That's how he's able to write Booker T. Washington and say, "I know your wife," or "Your wife knows of me," because they both were Fisk alumni. They become good friends and have a 9-year relationship, and Du Bois can be found very often in Tuskegee. The only reason why I don't assert that he taught a course there is because I was never able to locate anything that resembled a syllabus. That being said, in the summer of 1903, he is on the campus of Tuskegee, staying at Booker T. Washington's house. All of this can be proven. And then he goes to Boston, and he coalesces with Monroe Trotter, who has a paper that is not dominated or controlled by Booker T. Washington. And Trotter is one of Washington's chief critics in the public realm. Du Bois is friends with Trotter. He knows Trotter wasn't involved in the Boston riots, but he congratulates Trotter on his handling of the aftermath in the community. And Booker T. Washington does not like that. He's like, "You stay at my house, you coalesce with my children, my wife, and then you go to Boston and socialize with my arch enemy," right? And praise him in the public realm. But still, a grievance, but not unforgivable on the part of Washington. He does not take that to his grave. So Du Bois becomes a scholar who advances almost his lie. And out of Du Bois comes Van Woodward, who is a student of his. And from Van Woodward comes none other than who? Lewis Harlan.
So interesting. Such a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
interesting. I thought that Lewis Harlan's, what he wrote about Booker T. Washington, that he was sneaky and underhanded, was sort of similar to W.E.B. Du Bois's criticism too. But that's how he got things done, right?
Right.
So if you want to get things done, sometimes you have to,
Right.
have this machine. This,
Right.
This. Yeah, it's fascinating.
You
Also,
can-
so interesting too, the importance of the press, right? Like how in Africa do they hear about, like how, like all the connections, everything goes out through the press. In my book club, just a quick aside, I'm sorry, but we did The Defender, which was a wonderful, like I guess a biography of a newspaper and the people who ran it. And, you know, talking about how during Jim Crow, how the reporters would take this newspaper back to the South, and people living in the South really had no idea until the news filtered out to Chicago and then back into the South. So
Right.
I think the press is so important. And then the other thing about the normal school, like taking, you know, the bricklayers, and they have like, this is the way, this is the reason we make bricks this way. Like the normal, like all teaching schools in those days were called normal schools
Right.
because there was a way to teach things the proper
That's right.
way. So fascinating. Thank you again, that was wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Just one question. Dr. Wright, is it possible for you, can you elaborate on, when you speak of the 44 academic year, was that available for all Africans?
Can you repeat
At
that?
the-
I'm sorry.
In your photograph, it shows that there was, I think it was 44.
Industries,
Right.
right. Yes, there were 44 industries at Tuskegee.
Was that available for all those who participate or those who went to Tuskegee?
Yes, yes. So the typical curriculum, so in chapter 3 of this book, I break down the Tuskegee curriculum, okay? And so, of course, it was a school for teachers where they studied the academics and then mastered 2 industries so that they could teach that where they go. Matter of fact, one of the Tuskegee graduates who starts in industrial school, though, is Elizabeth Wright. She's the founder of what? Voorhees College in South Carolina. Some people may know about it. And she described herself as the same type of woman as the type of man that Washington was. So, whatever that meant. That being said, she would establish industrial school. Now, in her instance, really an industrial vocational school where they are teaching the trades, right? But she is a teacher who established an institution to teach other teachers how to teach students the industries. I guess if that's being clear. It's now confusing. But yes, they had 44 trades and industries there. And this was, just to give you a understanding of what they produced there, because this was, you know, I sort of, this could be like a 2-3 hour presentation, really, to be quite frank with you, just on the Tuskegee model alone. But there was a staff correspondent named Arthur Evans who wrote an article about Tuskegee, just critiquing what was being produced at Tuskegee, because arguably Tuskegee is a self-sustaining community that masquerades as a school. Okay? That's essentially what it is. And you understand that more and more as you go along in the book, because you will see Washington's recommendations to Liberia to say, every time you open a can in Liberia, import a can into Liberia, and open a can in Liberia, you seal the fate of Liberians in poverty. In other words, he's saying consume only what you produce what you consume. Independence through industry. And so the industries that are there at Tuskegee are self-sustaining. Sure, people will say, well, it's not sustainable. It's not a sustainable model because you need an injection of money from some white philanthropist. But yes, once that, well, first of all, let's just understand the legacy of slavery. The legacy of slavery is poverty. One group became wealthy while the other group became poor because they did not profit from their labor. Not then or now, to be quite frank with you, it's so the legacy, and legacy of enslavement is poverty. One group is enriched while the other group is essentially robbed. You are robbed of the benefits of your labor, okay? So where else was the money going to come from, right? At that moment in history, right? At that moment in history. But once money is put into Tuskegee, you can see how many times it goes around because the students are the major labor force and employees. So the money is staying within the community, okay? But this is what Arthur Evans says about Tuskegee. A school. Tuskegee is not a school in the ordinary sense of the word. It's a city in itself, a community that dominates a whole county. It's a great industrial plant with 40 trades and industries that consumes all its own products, that erects its own buildings, first making its own bricks, that grows its own food, makes its own clothes, writes and prints its own textbooks, all by way of education. So there's this concept that whatever is a human necessity for man, woman, and child, it is produced there at Tuskegee. We had a saying at Tuskegee, when students during the turn of the century were coming there, not the turn of the 20th century, the 21st century, right, so those coming there in the early days of Tuskegee, they would say, leave your underwear at home. We make our own at Tuskegee. Because the idea that the human necessity for man, woman, and child was produced there with their hands. So that was the point and the strength of Tuskegee. One of the things that Washington talks about is that there was no one who could come to Tuskegee that he and the Institute could not make useful to their people. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let me just throw in a statistic that is years and light years after that. When I graduated from undergrad from Tuskegee, I was very fully aware that most black students go to white PWI institutions, predominantly white institutions, but most black students graduate from black institutions. Look at the statistics, the data, yes, and it's not hard. It is not easy to graduate from a historically black institution. Anybody who's ever attended one knows it's hard, very hard, you know, but also a different kind of education as well. That being said, the strength of Tuskegee at that time, according to Washington, is that there was no one who could come there that they could not make useful to our people, period.
I want to,
How was the institution financed? How was the institution financed in the early days?
In a number of ways. So first you see Washington tell the state of Alabama, keep your money. Booker T. Washington goes on the road with people like Ford, and he raises money amongst white philanthropists. This is very much correct. He develops relationships with various white philanthropists, and he solicits money. Listen, this is the thing about Booker T. Washington that people don't understand, and I said this in another conversation, it's sort of like an interview and talk that I had about the book with the group that's reading it. We're very used to brutality and ruthlessness with regard to receiving that, okay? Meaning black people in America are used to being brutalized and used to ruthlessness, and particularly in Washington's period, 1895 to 1915. It's called the age of Booker T. Washington, but it's also called something else, the nadir, N-A-D-I-R, in history. It's called means our lowest point, one of the most violent periods in American history that most people would like to cover up now and not discuss at all, okay? Serious waves of ruthless violence. What we don't know is someone who was ruthless to our benefit and on our behalf. We know about people being ruthless to us, brutalizing us. We know about people being, in the contemporary sense, being ruthless to advance their individual interest. We don't know about people being ruthless for us and to our benefit. He was somebody, whatever he did out in the world, he never lost his way home. He made it back to Tuskegee. He didn't run off into the sunset. It's very hard to see where Washington's wealth and asset end and Tuskegee begins. Whatever he had belonged to the institution. And he was ruthless. As you get further in the book, you'll see at one point, at the turn of the century, somewhere around 1904, Washington is coalescing around a bunch of white philanthropists, which is what he did. What do presidents of institutions do? They raise money. That's their job. Quiet as it is kept. They're not administrators. They are fundraisers, okay? I mean, anybody who knows about the politics and the structure of higher ed or universities or institutes of educational institutions, that's what the president does. At the time, Tuskegee's endowment is somewhere around 1.5 million. 1904, 1903. He writes to this white philanthropist, he says, Tuskegee's endowment is 1.5 million. It should be 4.
I'm looking forward to definitely reading your book. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
But one thing, when you said about black colleges or universities, I went to graduate school at Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta, for my MBA, and I learned a lot. But one thing that made me want to go to Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta, I felt I was walking on the steps of Du Bois. I thought I was walking on the steps of the Julian Bond's family. I was right across the whole way from Martin Luther King when he walked past the Morehouse. So there was a lot of historical significance there, and we learned a lot. And I've looked at some of the ideas that you placed here today. I was very fortunate when I moved back to New York, because I'm from New York. I met the Talbert family. That was the president of Liberia before he was assassinated. And I learned a lot about the history of Liberia, tied it into his family in South Carolina when they moved to Liberia, and how important that whole family and structure was, what Liberia and the intricacies in Liberia, and how it worked well with the Agricultural Institute at Tuskegee. So I learned a lot at Atlanta University, learned a lot when I moved back to New York. And I'm looking forward to reading your book, look at some of the tie-ins there. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And we're going to put the website up so that people can also go to the website and share that. And if you wanted to purchase it today and didn't have cash, because I have a Square, but you can also go to the website, pay through PayPal, and get your book right then and there. So yeah. Yes. And we're going to put it up. The website is already up there in the tab. So thank you for that, because just to share some insight, this book is not my dissertation, but the evidentiary chapters are actually in my dissertation, the Liberian crisis and the African exclusion measure. However, the book itself was written 3 times well after that, and worked and reworked and, all of that kind of stuff. Yes, this was my first book. And so there's a revised and expanded version of the book coming out a little later this year. Thank you. But this came out originally in 2015, and so there's a revised and expanded. Several years ago, I wrote the revised and expanded version, but it's just now going to be published. But so what you get at a historically black college is intangible. Not intentionally. So I've been doing this work a very, very long time. I attempted to write my master's, and I have a master's in modern African history from City University of New York. I attempted to write about armed struggle in East Africa. I did not have the proper advisor. I stumbled across this article by Manning Marable and by Lewis Harlan. Manning Marable, Booker T. Washington, African Nationalism. He wrote that article. But he does not do the conclusive interpretive work to say Washington's a Pan-Africanist, not a Pan-Africanist. My assumption is that he did not have the gumption at that time to say what's being said in this book, but the evidence is there all the same. That being said, Harlan wrote an article. 2 articles influenced my research, why I go and begin to dig into Washington's personal papers. The second one is Harlan's Booker T. Washington and the White Man's Burden. The nerve. However, that article also produces a laundry list of African nationalists and others that Washington is in contact with that influence and transform him into the Pan-Africanist that he is. So please be clear. I'm not saying Washington was born a Pan-Africanist or anything like that. He goes through a transformational phase in his life where he has some very hard experiences with regard to European imperialism on the continent and the Togo expedition. He has intimate knowledge through his graduates as to the conditions on the ground. He is in touch with African nationalists who are born and raised on the continent, have been educated abroad and returned and established institutions and organizations. He has other people who he respects influencing him, people like Bishop Henry McNeill Turner. He has researchers who are on the case in particular cases like the Congo Free State. So he's getting, qualified knowledge on the conditions of Africa. And he's having this dialectical relationship with many of the people who are on the African continent because that is the primary way in which he understands the complexity of the situation on the ground under colonialism for African people. And he is transformed. So then you see him come out of all of those experiences after 1907, 1908 in a very different posture. Okay? Now he is armed. It is not simply theory. He has had some hard and catastrophic even experiences. What you'll commonly hear people talk about is the Togo expedition, where a couple of Tuskegee graduates go and work in conjunction with the German colonial forces. And Washington is the one who allows them to go and sends them. He is overzealous, uninformed, and not vetting the situation the way he should have. And those graduates die there, okay? So, I don't think it gets any worse. Now, there's a white male scholar by the name of Zimmerman who writes about the Togo expedition and he glorifies it. I do dedicate a section in chapter 4 on the Togo expedition, but I condemn it because it was meant to produce a hybrid, a variation of cotton that would be specific to the Togo using Tuskegee methods of cotton production. Tuskegee are known for what? Agriculturalists, right? However, the human loss outweighs the strides, and this is where you get to qualify things as Pan-Africanists or not. Who benefits? The German colonial regime. And what were the Germans doing on the ground in Africa? Attempting to impose or recreate Southern plantation life in Africa. Folk culture, they would call it, okay? To turn the indigenous Togolese into the formerly enslaved or the enslaved in America. They were up to no good, and their posture would be the same all over the continent. So, the Germans were only in Togo and Namibia, but if you understand what they did in those places, okay, the Germans would commit biological warfare in the 1930s. Nobody paid attention right? Because it was Africa. The Nama, Ovambo, and Herero people in Namibia were the victims of biological warfare at the hands of the Germans. So Washington, we had this conversation. So like, Washington is, he doesn't know enough to be sending anybody over to Africa. But what a hard way to learn. Everybody you send dies. If you want to know what his thoughts were about it, he tells you in the story of the Negro. I realized that I'll never make it to Africa. Okay, I'm going to send my students, so perhaps live vicariously through them. He tells you, right? He knows once he's at Tuskegee, he's never going to leave Tuskegee to go to Africa and do anything, really. Okay? But he had that in him. So he wants to connect, but it's not, you can't just do that. There has to be a particular way in which we engage the African continent and African people on the continent. Yes, even for those of us who are African people who were enslaved, or however you identify, black people who were enslaved, or whatever the case may be, if you, if you, you know, understand the history. So displaced Africans, whatever you want to call it. But for those who understand that, we have to understand that culture is an important thing, right? And what the Germans were doing was trying to recreate an oppressive culture for African people there, and work in conjunction with African people in America and African Americans. And when Washington is pressed on this issue, he makes it abundantly clear. He said, there's a white venture capitalist who's stationed in the Sudan who says to him, writes to him, because he believed the public narrative about Washington, that he was about acquiescing, he was about white domination, all of that kind of stuff. He believed that. So he writes Washington and says, you know, I want to colonize the Negro in the Sudan. And Washington responds to him so sharply, good luck to you, but I am not in favor of colonizing anywhere. So he does not have to tell you, I mean, you don't have to assume. These things are there. Right? All of this, I mean, to have 15 volumes of someone's personal papers, to go right to their words, you don't have to speculate, you don't have to engage in conjecture. But yes, because of what happened in the academy with Washington, white scholars can touch Washington, black scholars cannot. And how I get to this work is I don't have anything to lose, so I was like, what the hell? Like, let's go for it. But I also, just so you know, I didn't have that courage out of nowhere. I came from that institution, and I had been taught by a man who came to Tuskegee when George Washington Carver was still there. His name was Frank Toland. I was a history student. He was my history teacher. He taught African American history. He taught science and invention. He did my independent research that led me to looking at the lynching files, which is produced by Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington is actually the compiler of the lynching files. So when you see an image of a lynching between 1895 and 1915, more than likely that comes from a collection that Booker T. Washington compiled. It's called the Tuskegee University Newspaper Clippings Collection. Okay, largest collection of lynchings in the nation, over 2,000 images and articles of lynchings. So he was mapping them. He understood and that information that comes from that collection that's still sold today to libraries and archives from around the world is called the lynching files. And it is sold around the world. But that being said, Washington was collecting. This professor that I studied under, he pointed me in that direction when I actually did, I won't even talk about the project I was doing, but I was doing some research that would have been relevant to me looking at the lynching files. So I saw the lynching files even before they're on microfilm. They are still, whatever, real articles, and that's sacrilege for people who preserve things, right? Like you don't put any little greasy hands on anything. But I saw them before they are put on microfilm. That being said, this professor he comes to Tuskegee at 20-something years old, and he teaches at Tuskegee until he is 91, and he dies at 92. And the year he is 92, I am about to defend my dissertation. I wrote a thesis on Washington and Africa, and then I would write a dissertation on Booker T. Washington and African policy. Not because I was just like, oh, I'm so gung-ho, because someone on my committee who had seen my work on Washington and Africa said, are you serious? You have to go back to this. This is undone. And this is before I am fully aware of the magnitude of the cases that you will see and hear. But because I had a 90-something-year-old scholar who had been there at Tuskegee, and I heard things at Tuskegee when I was a student, like, Booker T. Washington is not exactly who you think he is. When I saw the lynching files, I knew that he wasn't, because what are you up to? Why are you doing this? I mean, so he was concerned about protecting this industrial community and its inhabitants, who in effect were his children, so to speak. And so the professor that I studied under, Frank Tolan, it was very hard, because if you see, there are articles written about this 100-year history in the academy on Washington. You're pushing back against all of that. So it's a very challenging thing. You could get a little discouraged, even though it's all there. It's just an amusement part, the collect Washington papers for anybody who can handle that. But you're talking about 15 volumes, each volume between 300 to 500 pages of personal papers. And you're going to have to make sense of this and piece these stories together. Luckily for me, at the time, the Booker T. Washington papers, which are in most libraries, major libraries across the nation, at that time, it was actually in a virtual space at University of Illinois at Chicago. So, which allowed a search tool where you could go in and just type in Africa and bring up every document where Africa is mentioned. But then you would have to do, in the way I do this work, every single person, like, who are they? You have to know who they are, the relationships, the context, all of that. And so I'm able to do that. And when I got weary, I had my 90-something-year-old professor who told me, keep going a little bit, it's there.
And the fact that it is beneficial to the collective. Mm-hmm. And if we apply that, I think that's important, because very often today, what goes unquestioned, both in American society and in the international global capital order, mm-hmm. is the belief that in order for us to have economic development and efficiency, someone has to win and someone has to lose. And that it is a zero-sum game in which there is no mutual advance. And your emphasis on Washington's model of Washington's Tuskegee model of development, when you look at it specifically as applied to the construction of the Tuskegee institution, mm-hmm. and I want everyone to notice this, Dr. Wright says, Washington represents a revolutionary break insofar as he says we are going to try to find ways to break our dependence on philanthropic generosity. And one of the ways that we can do this is to tap into the unharnessed labor, which is the primary contribution that we all have, that will allow us to both avoid being exploited mm-hmm. through usurious interest rates, but also give everyone a stake right. in the development of a particular locale. Now that's important, because right here now in the city of Mount Vernon, we have lying fallow lots of housing that essentially is on the verge of dilapidation and collapse. And we pull our hair out wondering, well, where in the world are we going to ever find the capital, the masses of capital that is needed to begin to, refurbish these structures? Mm-hmm. And far too often, what is overlooked is that the capital is in our very own muscles, arms, hands, feet, head, heart, as
Hand,
as Washington may have said. And I just wanted to underscore that fact, because one of the reasons that we do this work collectively is because we're hoping to uncover historical lessons from the past that maybe guide us into the future and allow us to meet those challenges that we know are growing in their intensity.
Right.
And in that sense, I have to say, because, you know, Dr. Wright, one of my preconceptions of Washington is that he's very much adheres to a conventional capitalist model of development. And the emphasis that you place on the Tuskegee model suggests that we need to consider this anew and perhaps even begin to try to find ways to update that and see if we can use that as our own.
Right. And so I understand your point, but is it a conventional capitalist model, telling people to own industry and training them in nation management skills?
No, it's not.
No, that's really not. I mean, what we have here, traditional capitalist model, is to produce a consumer class that consumes everything but produces nothing.
Right.
And you are perpetually enslaved by that.
Right.
Really, absolutely. And so, which is very dangerous, which is the condition we find ourselves now. But also, Washington takes that criticism even beyond the United States to the African continent, because he understands independence through industry reads very different on the continent of Africa. African people own the industries. They're independent and free from colonialism. What is colonialism doing to Africa? It's using African nations as extraction sites to extract resources and wealth and utilizing the people, exploiting the people for their labor. So you change that dynamic on the continent of Africa where you're in the majority, you change the trajectory of Africa and its independence. He knows that. He's very aware of that. Okay, and so are the colonial forces in Africa too, right? When you get to chapter 4, you'll see that they're very skeptical about having South African indigenous people coalesce with African people in America who survived slavery, because they feel like there will be a radicalization of the South African population by African people in America, by Black people in America. So I don't know if Washington's whole paradigm is very conventional. Because conventional means that, listen, so the capitalist paradigm, and let's be, I don't even want to get into a whole deep conversation of it, but I would just say this. One of the things about American society that's very perplexing is that the propaganda or the marketing tool of America, or the marketing spin of America, is that it is a place where people can experience upward mobility. But anybody who studies society or history, we know that when we draw that triangle, that pyramid of American society, right? At the bottom, right below that bottom line is what? The permanent underclass. Well, how do you have a permanent anything in a society that boasts about upward mobility or mobility between the classes? That's a dead giveaway that there is no mobility if you have a permanent anything. So we've gotten this idea that there are two, that capitalism, that the way it's expressed here is just about, businesses competing. And it's a little bit more than that. The form of capitalism expressed in America is someone must be on the bottom, and not temporarily, permanently. That used to be enslavement, perpetual enslavement. That's why when I teach students and we talk about systems and societies, I always make it clear about economic systems, socialist, communist, capitalist, all of those things. when you talk about America and you talk about America's imperialism, you are talking about, in first person, if you are Black, if you are African, you are talking about being the human commodity, bought and sold, that fueled it. So you've always got to pause with that, right? We're into free market and competition, but you were the commodity. And that should give you pause as far as, so it's more complex than that. It's the sort of management of human beings. Now, Washington, if he was a conventional capitalist in a sense, the students would have been slaves and not willing to put
No, I want to be clear, though. I was saying he wasn't conventional.
Right. No, I know.
No,
I know exactly what you're saying.
I was admitting I maybe bought into
Right.
the conventional notion, but
Right.
I've been disabused of that
Right.
thanks to your excellent
I exercised
scholarship.
it, right, yes. Right, so.
Hey, so on behalf of, I'm an educator, 20-year educator in New York State. On behalf of teachers in New York State, you have produced a mighty work.
Thank you.
And young people need access to this work. Your experience, your journey, you may not know the value of communicating
Right.
these kinds of efforts in your skin in this time to young people. So I feel very privileged to be here with you today, to be able to
Thank
go
you.
back to my students and tell them what I learned from you today, and also to be able to put your book in their hands. So thank you for what you have done
Thank you.
and what you continue to do.
Thank you.
The question that I have is, my students are 16 to 21, and they've been pushed out of other high schools to come to us to try to get it together. And when we get to a place where they begin to think on their own, right, because that's a practice, you have to learn that somewhere. They often have questions about, well, how do I do a thing I haven't seen before? So a question I have for you that I know that I can learn from and bring back to them is around what kind of challenges did you have in the endeavor of accessing the information? And what did it take internally and externally for you to piece together what we have now?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. So I'll start with what did it take internally or externally? Just so you know, I wrote this book 3 times because I was avoiding the ideological sort of political conversation. I thought that I could give an account of the historical facts without doing the interpretive work, right? Like without mentioning Pan-Africanism until like the very end or something like that. Because I already know, the history here. So people have given Du Bois the exclusive label of Pan-Africanist almost, right? I mean, we recognize Garvey or whatever, but African, so-called American, born and bred, African-American or Black experience, Du Bois is it, right? How dare you even call anybody else a Pan-Africanist of any sort? And Du Bois makes his contribution in terms of organizations that advance, the Pan-African Congresses. He's a sole survivor, right? He goes on to initiate the Pan-African Congresses in 1919. He's the only one living who was at the conference in 1900. And this body goes on to produce, 5 Pan-African Congresses, the 5th one being most important, and produces, or is the setting in which African leadership understand that continental independence and liberation is a must, right? And then the OAU comes out of that, and then the Organization of African Union comes out of that, and then the AU, which we should challenge them. But that being said, I was tiptoeing around it. I had all the evidence, right? But I didn't really want the backlash, I guess you could say, of saying what I already knew, really, so to speak, right? So then I just said, but the book wasn't working without explaining that what Pan-Africanism is, the history of it, what it is comprised of. You understand all the people who contributed to it, what it is theoretically and what it is in practice. So that second chapter, it doesn't work. This book doesn't work without you explaining what it is. It needed a theoretical framework, right? So after writing it 2 times, I just said, you know what? I slept on it, and I'm not gonna, say it came to me in a dream, but I was deep in it, and ultimately it sort of came to me, in between my comings and goings, possibly sleeping too, and not even came to me that he was a Pan-Africanist, but it was just like, okay, so you have to write this book. If you weren't afraid of anything, how would you write this? And this is how I would write it. And I just figured that I would go ahead and write it the way it should be written. Say what should be done. Theorizing takes some courage. It takes a lot of courage because it's human politics, and I come from a certain academic circle as well. And so who are not really aligned, well, they are aligned with it now, but at that time they weren't particularly, wild about this work because they were uninformed like everybody else. So that was what did it command or require me? It required courage. I had to write the book as though I had no fears and then let it just do what it was going to do. And that's what I did. The last and final time, I said, I'm not going to worry about what anybody has to say. I'm going to write it the way it has to be written. And so you can tell in the book, I know who I'm talking to. And also, too, I changed the book. It was a very academic sort of book initially. And then I was actually working for a publisher at the time. And I revised the whole thing and put it into what I call the people's language. I take it out of academic language, which by the average person is just gibberish anyway. And so what I try to do as a scholar in general is take very complex, because there are some things in this book that are very complex. Would you agree? Some situations that are very complex. But I think what I respect is taking some of the most complex things and being able to say it in the simplest way so it can be consumed by anybody. Now, don't get me wrong, that's the complete opposite of what academicians try to do. Academicians, I'm just saying, like, will you tell me or not? Academicians will take the simplest thing and explain it in the most complex way to make most of the people in the room feel like they are not intelligent. And I don't like that. Let me just say it in simple and plain terms. I do not like that. So what I sought to do was take the most complex situations and scenarios and some of the most nuanced situations and scenarios and put it into what I say is the people's language so that anybody could read this and consume it and understand it. I don't see, so, like Malcolm said, make it plain. Like, why are you trying to be all complicated?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, everyone. So it's been a wonderful discussion. I will ask everyone to conclude with one more question if it's a burning question, but we do have to allow adequate time to pack up our materials, and so we're going to get ready to wrap up. So final questions?
Yes, I'd just like to say, Dr. Wright, once again, I congratulate you on your book.
Thank you.
And I wish my granddaughter was here because I know she would have been very interested in it because this is the type of thing that she are.
Okay.
It's just one question that you have mentioned. When you spoke even a little bit, you said about the pyramid from the top and to the bottom and whatnot. And that, brought to my attention when you, when you showed it up there, when you said about the African exclusion of measurement, measures. this is something new to me. And I'm so glad that I was here to hear it coming from you, you know, about the Panama Canal, the
Canal.
Panama, the canal. I
Yes.
never knew that they had, or a people of colors had much to do with that building of that.
Oh, yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah.
and to say that legislation during Washington time, you know, they didn't want to pass, or didn't want, I guess it's to be known that Africans had such part in that. You know, it's very new to me.
Well, that was my goal, that people would come away knowing something that they didn't know before. By the way, that's the website that's up. We're going to scroll down, and you can, well, actually, if you wanted to go to the website and order the book now, and no, actually, you're fine with it, because, what happened? You see where it says home, about the book, order the book. You can click on order the book, and it takes you, no, it's actually okay. You don't have to do it. But it gives you a lot of information on the other pages about the cases. And somebody said to me, you give too much away for free. I don't care. It's there. And that's the point, right? Like, I wanted to socialize this book, if you understand. I wanted to make this information common knowledge amongst our people, not exclusive knowledge and information, okay? I wanted to socialize it, right? Because this belongs to us. This shouldn't be exclusive information only in the academy, where academics go back and forth and play with each other and carry on. No, this should be common knowledge amongst our people, because it also gives us a model in each evidentiary chapter on how to deal with each other, both domestically and internationally. Okay, Washington gives criticisms in critique and criticism and recommendations in the case of Liberia. Okay, about the conflict, ethnic conflict going on, and then there's also a model in the African exclusion measure on how do we challenge U.S. immigration and U.S. legislation internationally that is racist? How do we leverage our power within? That information is also in the Liberian crisis too, right? Because Washington talks about, to Theodore Roosevelt, who he is an advisor to, right? We were talking about this earlier. I was saying, Washington, who in the public realm is seen as someone who doesn't believe in voting and all of these things, but that's not true. You see him behind the scenes leverage the black vote on behalf of what? Liberia, the preservation of Liberia. How does that happen? How does this person born in enslavement know to leverage the black vote to preserve an African nation? And let's be clear, the Liberian crisis is not the best deal, but it is the live to fight another day kind of deal, because Liberia was in danger of being annexed, right? So there are some shortcomings to that, and I tell you what they are, for it. It was, it was the live to fight another day kind of deal. It was not the best deal going. It was the only deal going, the deal that Washington is able to push. And it's from him pushing, right? Because what they try to do above board doesn't even work. It's an under table deal, in order to preserve Liberia. So there's so many things. And then he gives Liberian people recommendation about how to manage, one, resolve the conflict between the Americo-Liberian and the indigenous Liberian population. This conflict will, in his opinion, will lead to the destruction of the nation. And it did. If you understand the role of the Americo-Liberian presence in Liberia, this is the seed of many years' war in the country. the Americo-Liberian population and the in relationship to the indigenous Liberian population. We have to be critical of that. And I lived in Africa. I lived in West Africa and Senegal. So that's a whole nother story, but we have to be very careful about our posture in relationship to Africa.
So, go on. Last question, please.
Just going back to the very start, is there any indication that Mr. Washington knew his parents, and did he have any siblings that he is aware of or was aware of?
Yeah. Yes. And the irony about Booker T. Washington is that, so I addressed that in, I think I addressed that in chapter 2 briefly. So Booker T. Washington, of course, knows his mother. He has the privilege of knowing and being raised by his mother. You don't often hear this, but he himself in Up From Slavery tells you, and I invoke it in this work, he tells you that his father was some stray white male from a neighboring plantation. He deems both his mother and this man who, from the way he says it, is not exactly a plantation owner, but could have been an overseer or a worker of some type, as the unfortunate victims of the institution of slavery, right? That being said, Booker T. Washington doesn't refer to himself as the terms of the day, mulatto. He does not go in search of his European ancestry. He does not. He's in search of Africa. And that's not what I'm saying. Go to the story of the Negro. He tells you himself. He does not pursue that at all. I don't, so he doesn't say much more about his origin, which is the irony of that, because, we're very, it's a real mixed bag with Du Bois and Washington. Du Bois, on race, this essay, he talks all about his ancestry, okay, and his non-African, his actually European and, whatever, ancestry. Booker T. Washington, he doesn't speak it. He doesn't speak it. He doesn't even pursue it, even though he knows. And so he lives with his mother and his stepfather, and they move to a particular part of Virginia where he begins to go to schools. And he has at least one sibling, maybe more than one, but they live in a sort of like a one-room house. And he had no last name when he begins to go to school. His stepfather, the man who is married to his mother after slavery, he takes his name out of necessity. So he had the name Booker in Telephero, but he adopts the name Washington, which was the name of his stepfather. But, he never had to think about having a last name prior to that. He was enslaved. He was property.
So everyone, I am to avoid any kind of struggle with my brother in the back.
Okay, yes. I think we hitting our limits in terms of time,
Yes.
right?
I want to firstly thank everyone for coming out and joining us. Again, none of this is possible without you.